The Earl's mirror. She inherited a cursed estate, and the previous owner was still there, watching her.
My mother always said painters see things others don't. I never believed her, until the night the man in the mirror blinked at me. Wintherstone Hall had been empty for 100 years. The estate records called it abandoned. No heirs, no living debts, no history worth the paper it was printed on. Just stone walls, just dust, just a silence so thick it had its own weight. They were wrong about the silence. My name is Isadora Crane. I came here to catalogue paintings before the demolition crew arrived in December. I was supposed to stay 10 days. I stayed much longer than that. And before this story is over, you'll understand why some warnings are carved in stone for a reason, why some veils are sewn shut with red thread and iron pins, and why some men, no matter how long they have been waiting in the dark, are absolutely worth the risk of looking. Stay close, subscribe, and whatever you do, don't look away from the mirror.
The telegram arrived on a grey Thursday morning in late September, slipped under Isadora Crane's door, while she was still in her painting apron, still smelling of linseed oil and burnt sienna, standing in the narrow corridor of her London flat, with a cup of tea she had forgotten was in her hand. She read it once. Then she set the tea on the windowsill, sat down on the edge of the nearest chair, the one with the broken arm she kept meaning to fix, and read it again. Miss Crane, your work has been recommended to us by Mr. Hargrove of the Aesthetic Society. We require a cataloguer of paintings and artworks for Wintherstone Hall, Derbyshire, before the property is demolished in December. The assignment begins October 1st. Compensation £30. Accommodation provided on site. Reply by Friday. Blackwell and Associates Estate Solicitors, London, £30. She folded the telegram along its original crease and held it in her lap for a long moment. Outside the window, London moved with its usual indifferent noise, a cart horse, a woman calling to someone across the street, pigeons. The ordinary machinery of a city that did not care about her rent, her dwindling supply of cadmium yellow, or the fact that her last commission had ended in August and nothing had followed it. £30 was 4 months of rent. £30 was everything she needed, and a margin of safety besides. She replied that same afternoon. She took the train north on the 1st of October with 2 large trunks, a leather portfolio of sketchbooks, a case of cataloguing materials, white gloves, reference cards, a magnifying glass her father had given her, a small brass ruler, and the specific calm of a woman who had learned, over years of working alone in large empty buildings, to carry her own quiet with her. The solicitor's file had arrived by post 2 days before she left. She read it on the train, with the Derbyshire countryside beginning to replace the Midlands outside the window, the light going flatter and more northern, the stone walls of the fields grey rather than golden. Wintherstone Hall had been built in 1778. The first Earl of Ashcroft, a man called Edmund, the file noted, with the brief confidence of someone recording only what they considered relevant, had built it on land his family had held for 3 generations. The title had passed to his son, and then to his son's son. The third Earl was named Dorian. She read his entry twice because the language was strange, not strange in content, but strange in the particular way that official documents go strange when the subject is inconvenient. The third Earl of Ashcroft, Dorian Harwell Ashcroft, died under disputed circumstances in October of 1801, on the evening of his engagement celebration. Disputed circumstances. She had read enough legal documents to know that phrase. It meant, something happened, and we have decided not to be specific about what. His fiancée, a Lady Cecily Harwell, was also listed as deceased, same evening. Cause of death, unknown. And then, in a footnote almost too small to read, in the swaying light of the train carriage, the only witness present at the time of the incident was Miss Vivian Harwell, elder sister of the deceased, whose testimony at the subsequent inquest cleared the Earl of any involvement in Lady Cecily's death. The Earl was found deceased the following morning. The train moved through a station without stopping. A village, grey stone houses, a church, a field of crows. Isadora looked at the file for another moment, then closed it and put it away in her portfolio. She looked out the window instead, at the landscape going darker and wider, the hills in the distance showing the first rust of autumn. She had catalogued a medieval church in Somerset. She had spent 2 weeks in a shuttered manor in Norfolk, where the previous owner had died without heirs, and every surface was covered in objects that nobody had touched in 30 years. She had once catalogued a collection of paintings in a house where the owner's widow still lived in the east wing, and every morning at exactly 7 the widow would walk through the rooms Isadora was working in without acknowledging her presence, like a ghost who had forgotten she was the one still living. She was not easily disturbed. This she knew about herself. She looked at the hills and thought about disputed circumstances, and did not quite think about the footnote. The hired carriage turned off the main road at 3:30 in the afternoon onto a gravel track that was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles, lined on both sides by old oaks that had grown into each other overhead. Their branches interlocked in a canopy that turned the light green, and then, as they went deeper, dark. The driver had gone quiet when they left the village. She noticed that. He was a local man. She had hired him at the station, and he had been talkative enough on the way out of Derby, commenting on the weather, the state of the roads, the hunting season. But the moment they turned onto the track, he stopped, and the quality of his silence changed in a way she couldn't precisely define. It was the silence of a person who had made a decision to keep looking forward. She looked forward too. The house appeared all at once because the trees ended all at once, not gradually, not one by one, but in a single line, as if they had agreed among themselves to stop. And there it was. 4 floors of dark Derbyshire stone, the facade long and symmetrical in theory, though something about the actual building resisted symmetry, the windows not quite aligned, the roof line slightly uneven in a way that was not quite enough to explain architecturally. The 2 towers at the far corners were covered entirely in ivy, not the decorative kind, but the kind that had been growing for decades unchecked, thick and black in the October light, pressing into the mortar between the stones, as if the building and the plant had made a private agreement about how things would go. The gardens had been formal once. She could still see the geometry of them, the ghosts of hedgerows, the outline of a parterre near the front steps, the remains of a fountain in the centre of what had been a forecourt. But the hedges had grown into each other, and then beyond each other, and were now a single dense mass, and the fountain was dry and cracked, and surrounded by weeds that were taller than she was. The house was not derelict. That was the thing that struck her, standing in the cold gravel as the driver unloaded her trunks with careful efficiency and an eagerness to be finished. It was not derelict. The roof was intact. The windows were intact. The front door, tall, dark wood, an iron knocker in the shape of something she couldn't quite make out, was closed but not broken, the paintwork old but not peeling. It looked like a house that had been maintained by someone who didn't want it to fall down, but also didn't want anyone to live in it. The driver left before she reached the front steps. She did not call after him. Mrs. Poole was already at the door when she reached it, a small woman, perhaps 60, with sharp eyes the colour of winter sky and the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from a long habit of watching everything very carefully before deciding to act. She had a ring of keys in her left hand and wore a plain dark dress that had no particular decade. It could have been 1880 or 1901 or somewhere in between. The dress of a woman who bought clothes to last and did not change her mind about them. Miss Crane. Not a question. I'm Mrs. Poole. I manage the property. Thank you for meeting me. The catalogue rooms are tagged. She turned into the entrance hall and Isadora followed, her footsteps louder than Mrs. Poole's on the marble floor. Red tag, catalogue, blue tag, sealed, do not enter. There are 3 blue tag doors. I'd ask you to respect that. Of course. Isadora looked up at the entrance hall. It was very tall, the ceiling disappearing into shadow above her, the staircase ahead splitting at the landing and curving away in both directions. The floor was pale marble with black veins, and despite the dust that lay on every horizontal surface, The marble itself was not dirty. Someone had cleaned it. Not long ago. How many rooms in total? 17 on the list. A pause, just slightly longer than necessary. There may be others. Old houses acquire rooms the way old people acquire opinions. I've been here 20 years and I still find doors I don't recognize. Isadora looked at her. Mrs. Poole looked back with the expression of someone who has said exactly what they intended to say and is now waiting for the conversation to move forward. My room, Isadora said. Second on the left at the top of the stairs. Dinner at 7. I keep a small kitchen in the north wing. She paused again. Miss Crane, if you find a door that isn't on the plan and isn't tagged, come to me before you open it. Isadora held her gaze for a moment. Has that happened? With previous cataloguers? Mrs. Poole began walking toward the kitchen corridor. There was one previous cataloguer, she said. He left on the second day. A brief pause. He didn't give a reason. That night, alone in the room that smelled of old lavender and cold stone, Isadora lit every lamp she had brought and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and read the solicitor's file from the beginning again. She was thorough. It was the quality that had built her reputation, such as it was, not brilliance, not genius, but the kind of steady, complete attention that meant nothing got missed. She read the estate history 3 times. She read the footnote about Vivian Harwell 4 times. The only witness present at the time of the incident. Outside the windows, the wind moved through what was left of the gardens with a low, continuous sound, not quite a moan, not quite music. She had heard wind in old houses before. She knew how stone amplified it, how corridors turned it into something almost deliberate. She knew that. She turned off 2 of the 3 lamps to save oil and lay down on top of the blankets, still in her clothes, her sketchbook open on the pillow beside her. Sleep came slowly at the edge of itself, half-dream. She was somewhere stone and cold and very still, and someone was standing in the dark not far from her, not moving, not speaking, just present, just waiting. As if they had been waiting for a very long time and had learned to do it without impatience. She woke before dawn to a sound she couldn't immediately place. Steady, quiet, deliberate, like someone writing. She got up. She put on her coat over her clothes, took the lamp from the bedside table, and opened the door. The corridor was dark and completely still. The sound was coming from somewhere below or somewhere ahead, difficult to determine in a house whose acoustics she didn't yet know. She followed it the way she followed anything that needed following, steadily, without rushing, paying attention. It led her down the main staircase, across the entrance hall, into the east corridor which the solicitor's plan had noted as structurally concerning, access not recommended. The floorboards there were uneven under her feet, but solid. She tested each step before committing her weight. At the end of the corridor, past 3 closed doors and a window that looked out onto the dark garden, was a door she had not seen the evening before. Or rather, a door she had not registered. It was there on the plan if she thought about it. A small room unmarked at the very end of the east wing. No tag on the door, not red, not blue. The sound was coming from inside. She stood with her hand on the door handle for a full 10 seconds, listening. The sound continued, steady, rhythmic, the specific sound of something moving across a smooth surface in careful, deliberate strokes. She opened the door. The room was small and rectangular and smelled of old stone and something she had no name for. Mineral, deep, the smell of water that had been underground for a long time. There was no furniture except a low wooden bench against the left wall, and on the wall directly opposite the door, filling the space from floor to ceiling, was the mirror, or rather, what had been covered to prevent it from being a mirror. Heavy black cloth, floor to ceiling, the edges stitched to the wall with thick red thread that looked as if it had been sewn very slowly by someone who wanted it to hold. The frame beneath it was barely visible, dark carved wood, pressing through the fabric in places. At the base, where the cloth ended 2 inches above the floor, the surface of the mirror was exposed, clean and bright as water, despite the dust on everything else in the room. And on the 2 visible inches of glass, in letters formed in the condensation on the cold surface, "You found this room." Isadora stood in the doorway for a long moment. She looked at the letters. She looked at the stitched cloth above them. She looked at the carved frame pressing through it. She crouched down, set the lamp on the floor beside her, and examined the letters more closely. The condensation was fresh. The letters had been formed from inside the glass. She could tell by the direction of the marks, the angle of pressure. Someone had written them from the other side. She took a breath. She pressed her finger to the glass, just below the words, and wrote in her own condensation, slowly, carefully, because it was reverse writing and she had to think. I did. She waited. The answer came one letter at a time, visible as breath on a cold morning, each mark deliberate. Were you frightened? She considered this honestly. Her heart was not completely steady. Her hands were not completely warm. But she had come down a dark corridor at 4 a.m. toward a sound she didn't recognize, and she had opened the door and she was still here. No, she wrote. Curious. A pause, longer than the previous one. Then, that is new. She looked at those 3 words for a moment. Then she pressed her finger to the glass again. What is your name? No hesitation this time. The letters came quickly, as if the answer had been ready for a very long time. Dorian. Outside, at the end of the corridor, the window showed the first thin line of grey beginning at the horizon. The October dawn, colourless and slow. Inside the room, the lamplight held steady, and Isadora Crane sat on the cold stone floor in front of a covered mirror and looked at a name written in condensation on old glass, and felt the particular feeling. She had felt it before in front of certain paintings, the ones that were genuinely extraordinary, of standing at the beginning of something that was going to matter. She wrote, How long have you been here, Dorian? The answer came slowly, as if the question cost something, as if it was the first time it had been asked out loud in a very long time. Since 1801. She read that, read it again. 100 years, she wrote. Yes, he wrote back. Alone? The longest pause yet. She watched the glass and waited and did not rush him, because some answers needed the full weight of their silence before they could be given. Until now, he wrote. She came back the same morning. After 2 hours of sleep and a breakfast, she barely tasted. Mrs. Poole had left bread and cold ham on the kitchen table without comment, which Isadora was beginning to understand was the caretaker's primary form of communication. Not silence exactly, but a series of deliberate omissions that said as much as speech would have. She ate standing up, watching the kitchen window. The garden outside was flat and grey in the morning light, the overgrown hedges still, the sky low and white. No wind, the kind of morning that felt like a held breath. She took her sketchbook and went back to the east corridor. The room was exactly as she had left it. The lamp she had brought the night before was still on the floor where she had set it. She hadn't thought to carry it back. She picked it up now, checked the oil, relit it, and sat on the wooden bench. The mirror's covered surface rose in front of her, that vast rectangle of black cloth and red stitching, the 2 inches of exposed glass at the base, catching the lamplight and holding it. She waited. For a moment, nothing. The room held its particular cold. Then the condensation began to gather on the glass, slowly, in the way it always did in a cold room when warmth was introduced. And the letters came. You slept. I did, she said aloud, and found she preferred speaking to writing when she could. It felt less like leaving a message for someone and more like a conversation. Then she pressed her finger to the glass. 2 hours. I came back as soon as I could. You didn't have to come back, I know. She paused. I wanted to. She paused. I wanted a stillness on the other side of the glass that was somehow different from the ordinary stillness of a cold room. She had begun to understand, in those few minutes of exchange the night before, that his silences had texture. Some of them were thinking silences, some were careful ones, some were the particular silence of a person who was deciding how honest to be. This one felt like the last kind. Then, why? She thought about that honestly, the way she thought about everything, not rushing to the first answer, but waiting to see what was true underneath it. Because I have questions, she wrote, and because you are the only person in this house who seems to know what is actually happening in it. Mrs. Poole knows more than she says. Mrs. Poole says almost nothing. Yes, he wrote, something in the brevity of it that might, she thought, have been dry. That has been her practice for as long as she has been here. How long is that? 20 years, approximately. She arrived in 1881. I watched her through the mirrors. A pause. She felt me watching, I think. She never looked directly at the glass after the first week. But she did not leave. Isadora looked at the covered surface above the exposed strip of glass. Thought about Mrs. Poole 20 years in this house, never looking at the mirrors, living alongside something she could feel but couldn't name, and had decided, in her particular practical way, simply to accommodate. Tell me what happened in 1801, she wrote. The silence that followed was the longest yet. She sat with it. Outside, somewhere distant, a crow called once and was quiet. Then he wrote, and the letters came slowly, each one as if it cost something. Where would you like me to begin from the beginning, she wrote. Cecily Harwell. The engagement. All of it. He wrote for a long time. Not continuously. She would read what he had written and he would wait, and then the next part would come. It was like reading a document written in real time, except that the document was someone's life, and the someone was watching her read it from 3 inches away. Separated by a surface she was beginning to think of as the most unfair barrier she had ever encountered. Cecily Harwell had been 22. The engagement had been arranged by their respective families, her father, his solicitor, a sum of money, a title, the usual architecture of early 19th century matrimony. He had met her 6 times before the engagement was announced. She was clever and quietly funny, and had opinions she expressed sideways, in the way women of that period had learned to express opinions, as questions, as observations, as things said lightly with weight underneath. Did you love her? Isadora wrote. No, he wrote back without hesitation, and she did not love me. We were both honest about that, which I think was what made us easy with each other. There are worse foundations for a marriage than mutual honesty. And Vivian? The letters stopped for a moment. She watched the glass. Vivian, he wrote, was a different kind of person entirely. He described her carefully, which she appreciated. He was not a person who used emotion as a substitute for precision. Vivian Harwell had been 26 in 1801, 4 years older than Cecily, the elder daughter of a baronet, the one who had received less of everything, less beauty, the world had decided, less charm, less social ease. She was intelligent in a way that made people uncomfortable, because she didn't hide it. She watched everything. She noticed things other people missed, and then said nothing about them, which was, Isadora thought, reading this, often more disturbing than saying too much. She had been in love with me, he wrote, for years, or something she called love. I was not aware of it until the night of the engagement. I have thought about that considerably in the time since. Whether I should have seen it. I did not. She told you? That night. She came to me before the celebration began, to the study. A pause. She was very calm. That was the thing I remember most clearly, how calm she was. She told me she had decided she could not allow the engagement to proceed. She told me what she intended to do, and you didn't believe her, no. A long pause. I should have believed her. Isadora sat with that for a moment. The weight of it. A man who had stood in a study 100 years ago, listening to something he could not quite take seriously, because it was too large and too wrong to be real, and had made the specific mistake of assuming the world worked the way he thought it did. What did she do? She wrote. Cecily died that evening. She collapsed during the celebration. By the time I reached her rooms, she was already gone. A pause. I knew immediately what I had seen in the study. Vivian's face when I looked at her across the room. I went to find someone, to report what I knew, to get help, to do something. The letters stopped. She waited. I never reached the door. The mirror, she wrote. The mirror in the entrance hall. It was hung there then, a large one, the same frame, the same glass. I don't remember exactly. I remember walking toward the door. I remember a sound behind me. I remember the mirror filling my vision, and then I was inside it, and Vivian was standing on the other side of the glass with an expression I have thought about many times since. What expression? He wrote one word. relief. She spent the morning of the third day in the drawing room, cataloguing the paintings as she was contracted to do, because she was a professional, and professionalism was, she had found, one of the things that kept a person steady when the ground shifted under them. The drawing room held 14 paintings. She worked through them methodically. Condition, dimensions, attribution where possible, period, any damage or restoration. She photographed nothing, she had no camera, but her sketches were precise enough to serve the same purpose. Her hand moving across the sketchbook pages with the practiced economy of someone who had been drawing what she saw since she was 8 years old. She left the portrait at the end of the room for last. It was a private portrait, not a formal commission. She could tell by the composition, which had none of the careful staging of official portraiture. He stood slightly to one side, in the clothes of the early 1800s, and whoever had painted him had caught him in a moment that felt interrupted rather than posed. Not arranged, just stopped, mid-thought, looking at something slightly above the viewer's line of sight. The expression was the thing. She stood in front of it for a long time, her sketchbook open, but her pencil still. Portrait subjects of the period arranged their faces for posterity. This man had not, or had not been able to. His jaw was composed, his posture correct, his dark eyes steady, but in those eyes something else entirely, something that had no name in the vocabulary of official portraiture, because official portraiture had no use for it. Grief held so long, it had stopped being grief and become simply the shape of things, as if loss had reorganized itself into a permanent feature of the face, indistinguishable, after enough time, from the original. The brass plate on the frame read, D. Ashcroft, 1799. 2 years before the night of the engagement, 2 years before everything. She sketched him from the portrait with unusual care, taking longer than she needed to professionally, paying attention to things the catalogue didn't require. The line of the jaw, the exact quality of the gaze, the way his hands were positioned at his sides, very still, neither tense nor entirely relaxed, the hands of someone holding themselves carefully. She was still thinking about the expression in the portrait when she went back to the east corridor that afternoon. "You were 28, she wrote. "The solicitor's file says 32. "The solicitor's file is wrong," he wrote. "I was 28. "The file also calls Cecily your fiancée, but it lists Vivienne only in a footnote." She paused. "Vivienne gave testimony at the inquest. She cleared you." "Yes." "Why?" The pause before his answer was not thinking. She recognized it now. The pause of someone who has had a great deal of time to understand something they did not want to understand. "Because," he wrote, "clearing me cost her nothing. I was already dead. What use is a cleared name to a dead man?" Another pause. She needed to be the grieving sister, the impeccable witness, the woman who lost both her sister and her sister's fiancé on the same terrible night. A brief stillness. She was very good at it. She has always been very good at being whatever a situation required. Isadora read that carefully. "She's still alive," she wrote. "You said that last night." "Yes." 100 years." "Yes." A pause. "The same bargain that put me in the mirror kept her outside it. I don't know the precise nature of it. I know that she has come back to this house 17 times in 100 years. I know that each time someone came to Wintherstone with the capacity to perceive me, to see me, to hear me, to respond, she removed them. How? Fear, mostly. The house has its own atmosphere. It is not difficult to make an already uneasy person unmanageable with a little additional pressure. The previous cataloguer," he stopped. Then, "She was in his room the second night. I could see it through the glass in his corridor. He didn't see anything, but he felt it. He left the following morning." Isadora thought about this, about the specific courage, or stubbornness, she conceded, that had made her follow a sound down a dark corridor at 4 in the morning, rather than lock her door and wait for dawn. Why didn't she do the same to me? "She tried," he wrote. "Your notes disappeared from the drawing room table 2 days ago. Your lamp was moved." She stared at that. She had noticed both things, had attributed them to her own distraction. "She's in the house," she wrote. "She is in the house," he confirmed. "She has a mirror in the north wing, second floor. Blue-tagged room. She uses it to move through the building. She has been watching you since you arrived." The room was cold, and Isadora sat very still on the wooden bench and felt the particular quality of that cold. Not temperature exactly, something else. The cold of being watched by something that had decided, not yet, how much of a problem you were. "She knows I can talk to you," she wrote. "Yes, and she's letting it continue for now," he wrote. "She is calculating. She always calculates before she acts." A pause. "Isadora, I need to tell you something." She looked up at the covered glass, at the stitched cloth and the iron pins and the red cord at the base, and the 2 inches of mirror showing at the bottom, at the letters forming on the glass in the cold air of that small stone room. "Tell me," she wrote. "The demolition," he wrote. "It is scheduled for December." "Yes, I know. If the mirror is destroyed while I am in it," he paused, "I cease. Not death, not whatever comes after death, simply cessation. The end of something that should have ended 100 years ago but was prevented from ending." Another pause. "Vivienne wants this. She has arranged for it. The demolition is not an accident of property law. She has been managing this estate through intermediaries for decades, making certain no one stayed long enough to matter, waiting for the moment when the building itself could be destroyed and the glass with it. And Mr. Blackwell," she wrote slowly, "answers to her. Without knowing it, I believe. She has had a long time to arrange things quietly." Isadora sat with that, with the full shape of it. A woman over 100 years old who had spent that century not on regret, not on grief, but on maintenance, on the patient, meticulous management of a crime she had committed before most of the people currently living had been born, on making certain that the one person who knew what she had done could never speak. She pressed her hand flat against the glass, not writing, just present. He looked at her hand from the other side. Then he placed his own against it, palm to palm, the glass between them. The cold went all the way through her hand and up her arm and settled somewhere near her sternum. "I'm going to find the evidence," she wrote. "There has to be evidence. She would have kept something." He looked at her through the glass for a long moment. Then, "There is a room below the basement. Tell me," she said. And he did. She found the panel on her 3rd attempt. The east wall of the lower corridor looked identical along its entire length. Oak paneling, the same grain, the same age, the same slight warping from decades of damp. She had pressed along it for 2 days, working systematically from the staircase end, pushing at each section at different heights and angles. Nothing on the first day, nothing on the second. On the morning of the 5th day in the house, she pressed a section approximately 4 feet from the end of the corridor at a point roughly level with her shoulder, and the wood sounded different. Not hollow exactly, but lighter, as if the space behind it went further than it should. She pressed harder, angling her weight into the upper right corner, and the panel pivoted inward on a vertical axis, swinging silently back to reveal a narrow stone passage, and beyond it, descending into dark, a flight of stone steps. She stood in the opening and held the lamp high and looked down. Cold air came up from below, deep and still, the cold of a space that had been sealed. The steps were cut stone, each one slightly uneven, the kind of workmanship that belonged to a part of the building older than the rest. The passage was barely wide enough for 2 people to pass, the walls close on either side. She went down. The room at the bottom was small and completely dark until she entered it, the lamplight preceding her down the last 3 steps and reaching the floor before she did. Stone floor, stone walls, no window. A low ceiling. She could stand straight, but not comfortably. Against the far wall, a bricked-up alcove, the bricks newer than the surrounding stone, the mortar paler. The outline of a frame pressed faintly through the plaster above the brickwork, large, rectangular, exactly the dimensions of the mirror upstairs. Vivienne had bricked up the mirror down here, had sealed it at some point when she no longer needed it, or had stopped trusting it. On a stone shelf to the left, objects. 4 of them arranged with the care of someone who had handled them often, not left carelessly, but placed deliberately, each one slightly separated from the others, as if each deserved its own space. A glass vial, perhaps 3 inches tall, stoppered with wax. Empty now, or nearly empty. At the base, a residue, dried to a dark ring. The vial itself was old, the glass thick and slightly green with age. A folded document, water-damaged, the edges soft with damp. She opened it carefully, both hands, not breathing too hard. Most of the ink was gone. The water had done its work thoroughly. But in the top right corner, protected by the fold, the heading remained legible. Harwell v. Ashcroft. Inquest Derbyshire, November 1801. Preliminary findings. Her hands went very still. She looked at the document for a long moment, then continued along the shelf. A lock of hair tied with black thread. Light brown, fine, almost silver at the ends where the color had faded. She did not touch this. She looked at it for a moment, and then looked away. And at the end of the shelf, the last object, a small leather notebook, perhaps 4 inches by 3, the cover embossed with a single initial in the center. The leather was better preserved than it had any right to be. Protected, she thought, by the cold and the seal of the room. She turned it over carefully. V. She wrapped the notebook and the document fragment in her white cataloguing cloth and put them in her coat pocket. She looked at the vial for a moment, then wrapped that too and added it to the pocket. The hair she left. Some things were evidence, some things were simply grief, and grief was not hers to carry out of this room. She went back up the steps, closed the panel behind her, and walked to her room without stopping. She read the notebook that night. She sat on the narrow bed with her back against the headboard and her knees pulled up, the lamp as bright as she could make it, and she read every page. The first entry was dated 1798. The handwriting was small and controlled, and applied itself to the page with the deliberate pressure of a person who had been taught that good handwriting indicated good character and had decided to take this literally. October 12th, 1798. Father confirmed this morning that Cecily is to be introduced to Lord Ashcroft at the Pemberton ball. The introduction has been arranged by Mr. Fellows. I was not consulted. I was not told until this morning. Cecily did not look at me when Father announced it. The next pages were intermittent, weeks between entries, sometimes months. The handwriting remained controlled throughout, but the pressure changed. The further she read, the harder the pen had been pressed into the paper, as if the control was costing more each time. Isadora read it all. The engagement announcement. Vivian's entry on that day, dated February 1800, was only 2 lines. It is done. I watched his face when he looked at her, and I understand now that I have been misreading something for 2 years. I have been seeing what I wished to see, the following months. The entries became shorter, more precise, observations rather than feeling, what Lord Ashcroft wore to the Harrington dinner, how he held Cecily's hand when they walked in the Harwell Gardens, what Cecily had said about the engagement to their mother. Vivian had overheard it standing in the corridor, which she noted without apology. Then, in the spring of 1801, a name. The woman at the village edge. Mrs. Trent calls her a cunning woman. I went to see her this afternoon on the pretense of purchasing herbs. She read that paragraph very carefully. Vivian had not been pretending. She had gone with a specific question. The cunning woman had given a specific answer. The details were obscure, written in the deliberate vagueness of someone who knew they were writing something that should not be found, who had wanted a record but also needed deniability. But the shape was clear enough. A bargain, a mirror, a name. Then October 1801, the night of the engagement ball. I told him in the study before the celebration. I wanted him to know it was me. I wanted him to look at me and see me, fully, completely, not as Cecily's sister, not as an inconvenience, but as a person who had made a decision. A pause in the writing. She could see it in the ink, the slight pooling where the pen had waited. He did not take me seriously. I saw it in his face. Even then, even at the end, I was not something he could quite believe. A gap in the pages. One sentence on the next page, in larger letters than everything before or after. I gave her the wine. Then 3 pages later, dated 4 days after the ball, it was not supposed to go as far as it did. I gave her something to make her ill, to delay things, to create a reason for postponement. I did not intend. The sentence crossed out. 3 lines of crossing out so thick the paper was almost worn through. Then, in the same controlled handwriting, resumed. The mirror held him. As she said it would. He is contained. He cannot speak, cannot act, cannot leave the glass. He is there, and I know he is there, and I am the only person in the world who knows. Cecily is buried. The inquest found nothing actionable. I gave my testimony, and I gave it well, and they thanked me for my composure under such difficult circumstances. I am the only person who knows what I know. That is enough. Isadora put the notebook down on the bed beside her. She looked at the ceiling of the room for a long moment. The low plaster ceiling of an old house, cracked along one line from corner to corner, the crack irregular in the way of something that had happened slowly over a very long time. Then she picked the notebook back up and kept reading. The later entries were different in character, shorter, more like notes than journal writing, observations, plans, records. Vivian had come back to Wintherstone Hall 17 times in 100 years. Each visit carefully noted, the date, the reason for coming, what she had found, what she had done. The entries about cataloguers and visitors were clinical in the way of someone recording professional decisions. Visitor, 1834. Collector, interested in the paintings. Began showing signs of perception by the 3rd evening. Managed by the North Corridor mirror. Gone by the 4th day. Cataloguer, 1867. Young man from London. Unusually sensitive. Required more direct intervention. Left the 2nd day in considerable distress. And then, near the end of the notebook, written in the same small controlled hand, but with, she thought, the very slightly different quality of recent ink. October 14th, 1901. Wintherstone Hall. I have come back, as I always do. The new girl arrived this week, a painter from London, young, dark-haired, sent by Blackwell, who remains conveniently unaware of his usefulness to me. She was recommended by someone at the Aesthetic Society. Her work, apparently, is notable for its unusual perceptiveness. I am paying attention to that word, perceptiveness. She has been here 4 days. She has not run. She does not have the quality of the others, the ones who felt something and turned away from it. She moves toward things. I have watched her through the North Corridor glass. She follows sounds. She opens doors. When she found the East Corridor, she did not stop at the end of the marked section. She continued. She found the small room. Blackwell thinks she will be easy to discourage. I am less certain. The demolition is set for December 9th. 7 weeks. I need her gone before then. The mirror must be in the building when the crew arrives. If she removes it or convinces someone to remove it, if he is released before the building is destroyed, he can speak. There are legal mechanisms still open. I have been careful to check this. A witness, with sufficient corroborating evidence, could reopen a century-old verdict. I am not dead. I have been very careful not to die. I cannot face what happens if he speaks. She has to go. The sentence sat on the page without elaboration. Isadora read it twice. Then she closed the notebook, set it on the bedside table, and sat in the lamplight with her hands in her lap, and thought with the careful, methodical completeness she applied to everything. She had the document fragment. She had the notebook. She had the vial. She had Dorian's account, which she had been writing down, in careful detail, in a separate section of her sketchbook since the first night. Dates, facts, specific details that only a person present at the events could know. She had 6 weeks. She had a very old woman somewhere in this house who had decided, in her particular cold way, that Isadora Crane was a problem to be managed. She picked up the notebook again, turned to the last entry, and read the final line one more time. She has to go. Then she set it down, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark. She was not going anywhere. They had developed, without deciding to, a language, not just the writing on the glass, the slow, deliberate condensation letters that demanded economy and precision, that made every sentence a considered thing, but a larger language than that. The language of when she arrived and how she sat and whether she set the lamp on the bench beside her or held it in her hand. The language of how long his pauses lasted and what kind of pause each one was. The language of where he stood in the glass, whether he was close to the surface, the way he was when they had been talking for a long time, and the distance between them had contracted, or further back, the way he stood when she had brought him something difficult that he needed space to receive. It was the language, she thought, of two people who could not be careless with each other because every means of communication they had required effort. It was a more honest language than most. On the morning of the 6th day, she came earlier than usual, before breakfast, before Mrs. Poole had stirred in her north wing kitchen. The house was at its most particular at this hour, neither day nor night, the thin grey of an October dawn pressing through the corridor windows without quite qualifying as light. He was already at the surface when she opened the door. She noticed this, had been noticing it. In the early days, she would arrive and the glass would be empty, and she would wait sometimes for several minutes before the condensation began to gather and the letters came. Now he was there when she arrived, as if he had been watching the corridor through some mirror she hadn't identified, tracking her movement through the house, knowing she was coming. She sat on the bench, set the lamp down, looked at him through the 2 inches of exposed glass for a moment before she pressed her finger to write anything. He looked back. This too had become part of the language, these moments of simply looking across the glass and the century between them, before either of them reached for words. In the first days, she had found the looking uncomfortable, too direct, too exposing. A person's face said things that their words, if they were careful, did not have to. She was careful, generally. She had learned to be. But the looking had stopped being uncomfortable somewhere around the 3rd day, in the same incremental way that a cold room stops being cold when you have been in it long enough. She couldn't have said exactly when. She pressed her finger to the glass. I found something in the room below the basement. His expression shifted, the specific shift she had learned to read as attention sharpening. Tell me. She described the shelf objects one by one, the vial, the document, the hair, the notebook. She described what the notebook contained, summarized the entries rather than reproducing them verbatim, because the glass surface was small and her finger was not a pen. But she gave him enough. The entries. Vivian's voice in them, that controlled precise handwriting. The single sentence. I gave her the wine. He read each piece of it as she wrote it. She watched his face. He was, she had understood by now, a person who had dismantled the mechanisms of visible emotion very thoroughly. Not because he lacked feeling, but because he had had 100 years of absolute solitude in which feeling had no audience and no outlet, and had been forced to become something private and interior and still. When she showed him difficult things, his face did not show what he felt immediately. It showed first the process of receiving it, a kind of inward stillness, a going deeper behind the eyes quality, as if he was taking the thing to where he kept things and placing it carefully. Then, after a moment, something reached the surface. When she wrote I gave her the wine, the thing that reached the surface was not anger. She had expected anger. What she saw instead was something sadder and more complex than anger, the look of someone who had suspected a truth for 100 years and has just been shown the confirmation of it, and finds that confirmation does not bring relief, only a final, complete weight. It's written in her own hand, Isadora wrote, in a notebook she kept and preserved. It isn't circumstantial. No, he wrote, it isn't. This can be used. She paused. Dorian, this can open the case. He looked at her for a long moment. His hand rested at his side. She had learned to watch his hands, the same way she watched them in portraits. He was not a person who used gesture often, which meant when he did, it mattered. His hand at his side now, fingers very slightly open, as if he had consciously released something he had been holding. I know, he wrote. You've been waiting for this. I have been waiting, he wrote slowly, for someone to look. She sat with that. She told Dorian about the notebook that evening, but she did not tell him everything at once. She had learned, over the days of their strange, slow correspondence, that he received difficult things better in pieces, not because he was fragile, the opposite of fragile. 100 years of solitude had made him into something with the density of old wood, but because he was precise, and precision required space between pieces. He needed to place each thing correctly before the next arrived. So she gave him the document fragment first, described it carefully, the heading, the date, the water damage, what remained legible. He read it through the glass with the focused stillness of someone reading something they had been waiting for without knowing they were waiting for it. Then she gave him Vivian's entries about the engagement, the years of watching, the controlled handwriting and what it cost her. Then the entry from October 1801. I gave her the wine. He went very still when she wrote that. Not the stillness of someone surprised, the stillness of someone who has just had the last uncertainty removed from something they understood, but had never been certain of. She watched his face and saw it. Not relief, not anger, but a kind of settling. The way a building settles when the last weight is placed on it. Final. Complete. She wrote it, Isadora wrote, in her own notebook, in her own hand. Yes, he wrote back, just that. Dorian. She paused, pressed her finger back to the glass. She's still here, in the house. I need you to tell me everything you know about where she moves and how. He looked at her for a moment. Then, why? Because, she wrote, I am going to find her. The north wing second floor was exactly as Dorian had described it, and worse. She went the following morning early, before Mrs. Poole had any reason to be in that part of the house. The corridor was low-ceilinged and smelled of damp in the specific way of a space that had been sealed against weather, but not against time, and the floor was worse up here than anywhere else in the building, boards that moved under her weight in ways that felt uncertain, not dangerous, but requiring attention. Each step a small negotiation. The blue-tagged door was at the far end. She had passed it every time she came to the east corridor staircase, had noted the tag, and walked past it the way she walked past everything tagged blue, because she was professional, and she followed the rules she had agreed to. She stood in front of it now without her white gloves, and without her sketchbook, and without any professional pretense whatsoever. The lock was old, a simple iron mechanism, the kind common in houses of this age, operated by a large key, or she had found in her years of working in old buildings, by a specific amount of pressure applied at the correct angle. She took a hairpin from her coat pocket. She was not a person who broke into locked rooms as a habit, but she was a person who, when circumstances required a specific skill, was practical enough to have it. The lock opened in 40 seconds. The room beyond was not large. A bedroom once, the proportions suggested it, the height of the ceiling, the position of the fireplace. But the furniture, if there had been furniture, was gone. The floor was bare. The walls were bare, except for the mirror. It hung on the wall directly opposite the door, uncovered, its frame an elaborate gilded thing that had shed most of its gold, and showed dark wood beneath. Full length, perhaps 4 feet wide. The glass was older than the frame. She could see the slight optical imperfection of it, the way her reflection breathed very gently when she moved. The same manufacture as Dorian's mirror, the same period. Her reflection looked back at her. Pale face, dark hair, coat still on, lamp in her left hand. The room behind her in faithful, accurate detail. Bare floor, bare walls, the open door. She stood very still and looked at her reflection for a long time. Then her reflection smiled. She had not smiled. It was not a dramatic thing. It was a very small adjustment of the muscles around the mouth. The kind of micro-expression a person makes when they are observing something that confirms what they already suspected. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then her reflection was simply her reflection again, and the room behind her in the glass was simply the room. She stepped back. She looked at the mirror for another moment. Then she crossed to it, stood directly in front of it, and pressed her hand flat against the glass surface. Cold. The same deep cold as Dorian's mirror. Not the cold of glass in a cold room, but something that lived inside the material itself. She leaned close to the surface and said, quietly and clearly, I know you're watching. The glass showed only her own face, the room behind her, nothing else. She held the contact for another moment, then stepped back and walked to the door. At the threshold, she stopped and looked back at the mirror one more time. In the glass, at a point just beyond the edge of her own reflection, a shape was visible. Barely. The suggestion of a figure rather than a figure, the idea of a person rather than a person, standing very still, at a distance that made it impossible to be certain of features, of expression, of anything specific. But it was there. Isadora looked at it steadily for 3 full seconds. Then she walked out of the room, closed the door, and went to find Dorian. She was there, she wrote. The mirror in that room. It's hers. She was in it. He read this. His jaw tightened. Did she see you clearly? Yes. She knows I found the room. Then she knows what comes next, he wrote. What does come next? He looked at her through the glass, not at her writing, at her face, the way he sometimes did when the conversation had moved past the point where he was choosing words and into the point where he was simply present with something, taking it in fully. She will act, he wrote. She has been patient for 100 years, but patience has a limit, and she knows you have the notebook. She knows you have been in the room below. She knows what you found there. A pause. She will try to take it back. How? I don't know exactly. A pause that was not thinking but something more careful. The pause of a person who has spent a long time watching someone and has formed conclusions about them that they do not want to overstate. Vivienne does not do things she is not certain of. She will wait until she believes the moment is right, until you are alone, until there is an opportunity to manage you the way she has managed others. Frighten me away, Isadora wrote. Or worse, he wrote. Then, more slowly, I don't know how far she will go. She has never been tested this directly before. Isadora looked at that. The lamp was burning low, and she reached down and adjusted the wick without taking her eyes from the glass, from his face, from the particular quality of his expression right now. Controlled as always, composed as always, but with something beneath the composure that she had not seen before. Something that had the texture of concern and was directed specifically and entirely at her. You're worried about me, she wrote. He looked at her for a moment. Then, you are the first person in 100 years who has stayed long enough to matter, he wrote. Yes, I am worried about you. The room was cold and quiet, and the lamp burned its small, steady light, and Isadora sat on the wooden bench with her finger resting on the glass, and felt something in her chest that had no quick name, but was warm and serious and not small. I am not going to run, she wrote. I know, he wrote back. That is precisely what worries me. The accident happened 2 days later. 2 days. She was in the ground floor corridor that ran between the library and the drawing room, carrying a stack of reference cards she had been updating in the library and intended to cross-check against her earlier notes. The corridor was narrow there, the ceiling lower than in the main rooms, one window at the far end providing the only natural light. She heard the sound behind her. Not footsteps. Something different. A slow creak, like weight on wood that was not quite able to bear it. She turned. The large framed map of the estate that had been hanging on the corridor wall, the one she had noted on her first day, catalogued, flagged as historically interesting, a hand-drawn survey of the grounds from approximately 1790, was coming off the wall, slowly, as if it had been lifted at one corner and was being lowered with deliberate care. She watched it for the full second it took to understand what she was seeing, and then she moved to the side, and the map came down and struck the floor exactly where she had been standing, the frame cracking on impact, the glass shattering across the corridor stone. She stood very still with her back against the opposite wall. The corridor was empty. The window at the end showed only the flat grey October sky. The map lay on the floor broken, the glass scattered. She looked at the wall where it had hung. The wire was still in place, attached to the frame's hanging hook. The plaster fastening that had held the wire was intact. The map had not fallen. The wire had not broken. Something had lifted it off the wall and set it down. She looked at the shattered glass for a moment, then looked up at the corridor ceiling, at the moulding along the top of the wall where it met the ceiling, and at the mirror, small and oval, that she now noticed for the first time hanging in the corner junction above the corridor door, half obscured by the moulding. She had missed it in her initial survey. She had been thorough, but she had not been looking up. She looked at it directly. The mirror was too small and too high for her to see anything in it from this angle, except the corridor and the broken frame on the floor and a small section of the ceiling. But she felt it. The same quality of cold she now recognized. Not temperature, but attention. The feeling of being in the center of someone's focus. She bent down and began collecting the pieces of glass from the floor, carefully, her gloves on. "You'll need to do better than that," she said to the corridor, to the small mirror in the corner, to the cold in the air that had no source. Her voice was even. She was proud of that, too. She finished collecting the glass and went to tell Dorian. "She tried to hurt you," he wrote, and the letters came faster than usual. "She tried to frighten me." Isadora paused. "The map would have broken my hand if it had landed on it. Perhaps more." He was very still for a long moment. Then, "This is different from what she has done before. I know. She is escalating." He looked at her. "Isadora, I need to ask you something directly. Ask. Do you understand what will happen if you leave? If you take the evidence to London and present it, the notebook, the document, the account I have given you, without the mirror being destroyed? Without me being—" He stopped, started again. "There are legal mechanisms still open," you said, "but they require a witness, and I am in a mirror in a condemned building. She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since she read Vivienne's last journal entry. She had gone through the problem from every angle she had, in the way she went through everything, methodically, completely, not looking away from the parts that were difficult. "I know," she wrote. "The evidence needs a witness to support it. The witness is you, and you can't leave the mirror." A pause. "Not yet." He read that. "Not yet," he wrote back slowly. "I've been reading," she wrote. "In the library there is a letter, 1803, in a collection of correspondence from a woman in the village who wrote to a colleague about the working she had done here. She described the conditions of it." She paused. "To undo it, the true account must be spoken aloud in the place of the binding, by a witness not bound by it, in the presence of the glass." She watched his face as he read this, watched him go through it carefully, the way he went through everything. "You," he wrote, "a witness not bound by it. Yes, in this room. Yes, speaking the true account. I have it," she wrote, "all of it, written in my sketchbook, dated, signed, witnessed by myself." She paused, and supported by the notebook, the document, and the vial. Another pause. "Dorian, I think it will work." He looked at her for a very long time. She held his gaze and did not look away, and let him take the time he needed, because this was not a small thing, and she was not going to treat it as one. Then he wrote, and the letters came slowly and with weight. "And if it doesn't? Then I leave with everything I have," she wrote. "I find a solicitor who isn't Blackwell. I find a legal historian. I find someone who can reopen a 100-year-old case with the evidence I've collected." She paused. "And I come back. You would come back." "Yes." For a man in a mirror. She looked at that for a moment. Then she wrote, because the mirror had always required honesty, and she had stopped pretending otherwise several days ago, for you, not for a mirror. The glass fogged very slightly where his breath came close to it from the other side. She watched it happen, that small evidence of breath, of being, of something alive behind all that old, cold glass. He wrote, Isadora, just her name. And then, "Thank you." She looked at the two words for a long moment. Then she pressed her palm flat against the glass again, the way she had on other evenings, and he placed his against it, palm to palm, the cold going through her hand and up through her arm. "Don't thank me yet," she wrote. "We still have Vivienne." The corner of his mouth moved. "Yes," he wrote, "we do." She made a list. This was how she approached problems, not by thinking in abstractions, but by writing things down, because writing made the vague specific and the specific manageable. She sat at the small writing desk in her room on the evening of the 7th day, with the lamp at its brightest and the door locked and her sketchbook open to a fresh page, and she wrote down everything she had. Evidence: Vivienne's personal notebook, 1798-1901. written in her own hand, contains explicit admission of administering a substance to Cecily Harwell, contains 100-year record of deliberate obstruction of any investigation. Document fragment. Harwell v. Ashcroft, Inquest 1801. Preliminary findings. Partial, but the heading and case reference are legible. Glass vial with residue. Possible physical evidence of the substance used. My written account of Dorian Ashcroft's testimony, as communicated to me through the Mirror at Wintherstone Hall, October 1901. Dated, signed. She looked at the list. Then she wrote below it, "What I need. The true account spoken aloud in the presence of the glass. Dorian released. Vivian unable to interfere. The third point was the one she had been thinking about most carefully. Vivian had spent 100 years making certain that nothing and no one in this house could threaten her. She had access to the mirrors. She had whatever the bargain had given her, a century of preserved life, the ability to move through this building in ways that ordinary people could not. She had patience and intelligence and the specific ruthlessness of someone who had already done the worst thing and had found it survivable. She was not going to stand quietly in a mirror while Isadora Crane broke 100-year working in the room below. She needed to be contained, or absent, or both. Isadora thought about this for a long time, her pen resting on the paper, not writing. The house was quiet around her, the particular evening quiet of Wintherstone, which was never quite like ordinary quiet, always slightly textured, always carrying something underneath it. She had stopped being disturbed by it days ago. It was simply the sound of a place with a long memory. Then she wrote one more line on the page, "Ask Mrs. Poole." She found the caretaker in the kitchen at 7 the following morning, as she always was. The small precise ritual of Mrs. Poole's mornings apparently immune to everything else that was happening in the house. Tea on the table, bread cut, the kitchen fire burning cleanly. She sat down across the table from Mrs. Poole and put her hands flat on the wood and said, "I know what is in this house. I know what happened in 1801. I have the evidence for it." A pause. "And I need your help." Mrs. Poole looked at her hands around her teacup. Then she looked at Isadora's face with those winter sky eyes and the expression of someone who has been waiting, with the specific patience of a practical person, for a conversation they have known was coming. "You've been talking to him," she said, not a question. "Yes." "Through the mirror in the east corridor?" "Yes." Mrs. Poole was quiet for a moment. She set her cup down. She looked at the kitchen fire. "I have known this house for 20 years, she said, "and I have known that something was in it that I did not understand and was not going to pretend to understand. I have known that the woman who comes here, the one who uses the north wing room, is not a natural thing." A pause. "I have not left, because leaving seemed cowardly, and because—" Another pause, more careful. "Because I could feel that whatever was in this house was not malevolent. It was contained. And contained things that are not malevolent deserve better than to be simply left alone." Isadora looked at her for a moment. "He is innocent," she said. "His name was never properly cleared. The woman who put him in that mirror is the one who actually killed Cecily Harwell. I have her own written admission of it." Mrs. Poole absorbed this with the stillness of a person receiving news they already suspected and are deciding how to feel about it being confirmed. Then she said, "What do you need?" "The night I speak the account in the mirror room, Vivian cannot be in the house. She needs to be removed from the north wing mirror before I begin, or she will interfere." She paused. "Can you do that?" Mrs. Poole looked at her for a long moment. Then she stood up, went to the kitchen dresser, and opened the second drawer from the bottom. She took out a cloth, unwrapped it on the kitchen table, and set down two objects, a length of black ribbon and a small round mirror, 3 inches across, the kind that belonged in a woman's dressing table. The back was silver, heavily tarnished. On the face, the glass was covered with a piece of black paper, cut precisely to fit and held in place at the edges, with the same red thread Isadora had seen stitching the cloth to the frame in the east corridor. "This was in the house when I arrived," Mrs. Poole said, "in the kitchen in a box with other domestic objects, as if someone had deliberately hidden it in plain sight. I took it from the box and covered it, and have kept it covered for 20 years. She looked at Isadora. I don't know what it is exactly, but I know that when I covered it, the kitchen became a room where I could simply work. Before that, she paused. It watched. Isadora looked at the small covered mirror. There are mirrors throughout this house that she uses, she said. The north wing room has the main one, but there are smaller ones in several corridors. I found 3 of them. If all of them are covered before I speak the account, she cannot move, Mrs. Poole said. Not a question. I believe so, yes. Mrs. Poole picked up the ribbon and the covered mirror and held them. She looked at the kitchen fire for a long moment, and Isadora saw something move across her face. Not fear exactly, but the serious consideration of a practical person deciding whether a risk is worth taking. Deciding that it was, but wanting to understand it fully first. One evening, she said at last. You need one evening. Yes. Then tell me where the other mirrors are. That afternoon, while Mrs. Poole moved methodically through the house with her cloth and her red thread, Isadora went back to Dorian. She told him the plan, described every part of it, Mrs. Poole covering the corridor mirrors, the north wing room sealed, the small kitchen mirror already dealt with, the evening she had chosen, 3 days from now, when she had the account fully written, when she was certain of every word. He listened through the glass with the focused attention he brought to everything important, the particular quality of listening that was not passive but active, a leaning in despite the glass, a presence that felt physical even through all the barriers between them. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then, 3 days. Yes. And then... He stopped. She watched him consider the words available to him, finding them insufficient one by one. And then, I am either free or I am not. And if I am not, you leave with the evidence and find another way. Yes, she wrote. Exactly. You have thought about what happens if it works, he wrote. Not a question. She had. She had thought about it with the same care she gave everything, and she had found it both simpler and more complicated than she expected. You will need clothes, she wrote, that are not 1801. And a solicitor. And someone who can help establish your identity to a world that has had no record of you for 100 years. A pause, and probably a great deal of patience with how much has changed. The corner of his mouth moved. I have had some practice with patience. You have, she agreed. A pause. Something shifted in his expression, not one of the shifts she had learned to read, something less controlled than those, something that came from deeper. Isadora, he wrote, if this works, if I am standing in that room and the glass is simply glass and I am simply a man... He stopped. She waited. I don't know how to be simply a man, he wrote. I have not been simply a man for 100 years. I have been this. He gestured, a small movement of his hand indicating the space behind the glass, the mirror, the whole architecture of his existence. I don't know what I am without it. She looked at him for a long moment, at his face in the lamplight, the familiar lines of it, the quality of the gaze, the jaw, and the dark eyes, and the expression she had been reading for 10 days, and could read now with a fluency that surprised her when she thought about it. She pressed her finger to the glass. You are the same person you have been in every conversation we have had, she wrote. The mirror did not make you. It only held you. A pause. And when it stops holding you, you will still be you. I promise you that. He read it. She watched him read it. Then he placed his hand against the glass, and she placed hers against it, and the cold went all the way through her arm and into her chest, and she held it there, and did not pull back. 2 days before she intended to speak the account, she found the second journal. She had been back in the library, but not cataloguing now, but searching, working methodically through the shelves with the specific focus of someone who knows what she is looking for and has narrowed down where it must be. Dorian had told her in one of their evening sessions that he had once watched Vivienne spend an hour in the library on one of her return visits, focused on a specific section of the lower shelves. Not the household accounts section, the section to the left of it, correspondence, estate papers, documents that had accumulated without any particular organization over 3 generations. She found it on the second afternoon of searching, in a gap between two boxes of estate correspondence that had been pushed slightly apart. A slim volume, bound in dark cloth, no title on the spine. Inside the front cover, a date, 1843, and below it, in Vivian Harwell's familiar small controlled hand, a record of certain observations for the period 1838-1848. She sat down on the library floor, her back against the shelves, and read it. It was different from the first notebook in character, less personal, more like a research record. Vivienne had spent the decade documented here pursuing something specific, not managing the house, not covering tracks, but investigating. She had travelled. She had met people she described only as the practitioner in Edinburgh, and the woman who holds the Eastern working and the correspondent from Paris who understands mirror binding better than anyone I have met in England. She had been building knowledge, the way a scholar builds knowledge methodically and with patience. What she had been trying to understand was the exact conditions under which the binding could be broken. The binding requires a voice, she had written in 1845. Not simply the words. Many people have spoken true things in that room, and nothing has changed. A voice that the working recognizes as legitimate. An exterior witness, the practitioner called it. Someone with no investment in the outcome except the truth of it. Someone who came to it freely and without compulsion and saw clearly. Isadora sat with that for a moment. The woman from Paris was more specific. The entry continued. She said, "Someone who chose to stay when they could have left. Someone who looked when they could have looked away. The working," she said, "is testing something. It has been testing it for 40 years, and none of the people who came here passed the test. None of them," Vivienne had written, stayed. She closed the journal. She held it in her lap for a long time, in the cold library, with the autumn light going flat and grey in the windows above her, and the house very quiet around her. Someone who chose to stay when they could have left. She thought about the telegram. £30, the decision to reply that same afternoon, the carriage track through the oaks, the door that was already open, the sound in the dark at 4 in the morning, and the choice she had made, not quite consciously, somewhere below the level of calculation, to follow it. She thought about every moment since when leaving had been possible, and she had not left. She thought about why. She went to the mirror room that evening, later than usual. Mrs. Poole had finished covering the corridor mirrors that afternoon. She had moved through the house with quiet thoroughness, the red thread and black cloth, the same method used on the kitchen mirror, covering each small oval in the upper wall corners, with the attention of someone who understood that precision mattered here. She had not asked questions. She had reported back to Isadora in the kitchen with a list of the ones she had found and those she had missed on first survey, and they had gone through the corridor together to check them all. The north wing room she had sealed herself, alone, while Isadora was in the library. She had come back to the kitchen and made tea without speaking for several minutes, and then had said simply, "It's done." Isadora had looked at her and not asked what she had felt in that room. Now she opened the east corridor door and carried her lamp to the end and sat on the wooden bench and looked at the covered mirror. He was there immediately. She could feel it even before she looked at the glass. The quality of his attention, the directed presence that she had come to know so well over 10 days, that she could distinguish it from the ordinary atmosphere of the room, the way you distinguish a voice you know well in a crowded room. She looked at the 2 inches of glass at the bottom. He was closer to the surface than usual. "One more day," she wrote. "Yes," he wrote back. She looked at his face. He was looking at hers. The lamp burned between them, casting its particular warm light, and the shadows were deep on both sides of the glass, and the house was settled around them in its evening quiet. "Are you afraid?" she wrote. He read that. His expression did something careful, the specific careful movement of someone deciding to be honest rather than composed. "Yes," he wrote. Then, after a moment, "Not of the working, not of what happens if it fails." A pause. "I am afraid of what I will be on the other side of it. I have been this thing." He gestured again, the small indicating movement she had come to know. "For so long that I am not certain I remember how to be the other thing. A man," she wrote. "A man," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she pressed her finger to the glass and wrote slowly. "Then let me tell you what I have observed." He waited. "You are precise," she wrote. "You think carefully before you speak, and you do not say things you don't mean. You are honest in the specific way that requires courage, not brutal honesty, but the kind that costs something. You notice things. You have been watching this house for 100 years, and you have spent that time understanding rather than simply enduring." She paused. "You are the most present person I have ever had a conversation with. And I have had a great many conversations." He read each sentence as she wrote it. She watched his face through the glass, the careful composure, and underneath it, something that was moving toward the surface in the slow way things moved in him. Nothing fast or uncontrolled, everything deliberate. "You have been watching me," he wrote. "Yes," she wrote, "the same way you watch the house." A pause, with attention. He looked at her for a long time. The lamp between them was burning low, and she did not reach down to adjust it this time, because reaching down meant looking away, and she did not want to look away. "Isadora," he wrote. "Yes. When this is over..." He stopped, started again. "If I am standing in that room and the glass is simply glass..." A pause. "I would like to continue the conversations." She looked at those words for a long moment. Then she wrote, "So would I." The condensation on the glass held the words perfectly, clear and still in the lamplight, and neither of them wrote anything else for a long time, and the silence between them was the kind that didn't need filling. The last thing she did that night was write out the account in full. She sat at the writing desk in her room with 3 sheets of paper and her best pen, and wrote everything from the beginning, dated, structured, specific. Dorian Ashcroft, 3rd Earl of Ashcroft, born 1773. The engagement to Cecily Harwell, arranged February 1800. The night of the engagement ball, October 14, 1801. What Vivian Harwell had told him in the study before the celebration. What he had found when he reached Cecily's rooms. What he had seen in Vivian's face. The mirror in the entrance hall. The 100 years since, she wrote Vivian Harwell's name clearly at every relevant point. She wrote what the woman had done, and when, and with what. She cited the notebook. She cited the document fragment. She cited the vial. Then she signed it. Isadora Jane Crane, painter and art cataloguer, London. October 21st, 1901. Wintherstone Hall, Derbyshire. She folded it carefully and put it with the other evidence in the leather case she'd been keeping locked since she found it. Then she went to bed and slept, for the first time in 10 days without difficulty. She woke before dawn on the day she had chosen. The house was completely quiet. The kind of quiet that she understood now was not absence but fullness. Every corner of the building settled into itself, holding its particular weight. She lay still for a moment and listened to it. Then she got up. She dressed carefully. This was not a deliberate ceremony. She was not a person who attached significance to clothes, but she found herself choosing her good coat, the dark green one with the proper buttons, and taking time with her hair. It was a kind of respect for the occasion, for him. She made tea in the kitchen. Mrs. Poole was already there, which did not surprise her. The caretaker stood at the kitchen window with her own cup, looking out at the dark garden, and did not say anything when Isadora came in. They drank tea in a silence that was comfortable in the specific way of two people who have understood each other without needing to say so. At 5:30, Mrs. Poole said, "I'll be in the entrance hall. If anything irregular occurs, I'll be there." "Thank you," Isadora said. Mrs. Poole looked at her with those winter sky eyes. "He is innocent," she said. "You are certain?" "Yes." "Then go." The east corridor was dark, the lamplight making the shadows move. She walked it for the last time with the particular attention of someone walking a familiar path, knowing it is the last time, noting the details, the exact quality of the damp smell, the sound of the boards under her feet, the narrowing of the corridor toward its end, the door at the end, the room beyond it. She set her lamp on the bench. She took her written account from the leather case she had carried with her. She stood in front of the covered mirror and looked at it for a moment. The black cloth, the red stitching, the iron pins along the top edge. Then she looked at the 2 inches of exposed glass at the base. He was there, not close to the surface this time, slightly back, the way he stood when something had weight. She could see him clearly in the lamplight, the dark coat, the white cravat, the line of his jaw, the dark eyes that had been watching this house for 100 years, and were watching her now with an expression she could read completely. She had been afraid, briefly, the night before, that she would not know what to feel when this moment arrived, that the careful, controlled competence she brought to everything would be what was there, and nothing else. But standing in this room in the lamplight, holding the account she had written, looking at the face she had come to know through glass and condensation and slow, deliberate letters, she knew exactly what she felt. It was not complicated. It was warm and serious and had the specific quality of something that had been building, one conversation at a time, over 10 days of very close attention. She looked at him. He looked at her. She pressed her finger to the glass one last time. "Ready?" she wrote. He read it. He looked at her face. Then he placed his hand against the glass, palm open, and held it there. She pressed her palm against his through the glass, cold, solid, the familiar deep cold of it, and held it for a moment. Then she stepped back, unfolded her paper, and began to read. She read clearly and completely, at the pace she would use for something that needed to be heard precisely. Not rushed, not performed, simply spoken with the full weight of her attention behind it. Every word she had written was there, and she gave every word the care it was due. She spoke Dorian Ashcroft's name. She spoke the date, the place, the engagement, the celebration. She spoke what Vivian had said in the study before the ball began, and what Dorian had found in Cecily Harwell's rooms, and what he had seen in Vivian's face across the room, and what had happened when he walked toward the front door. She spoke Cecily Harwell's name. She spoke what had been done to her and when and by whom. She spoke Vivian Harwell's name clearly and completely, and said what the woman had done, and how she had done it, and what it had cost, and how long the cost had been paid by someone else. She said, "This account is given freely, without compulsion, by a witness who came to this house as a stranger, and who stayed by choice, and who has seen clearly, and who speaks the truth as she understands it to be true." The room changed. She felt it before she saw it. A shift in the air, or not the cold leaving, but the quality of it changing, the deep mineral cold that had lived in the glass and the walls and the floor of this room for 100 years beginning to move, to loosen, the way ice loosens when something underneath it changes. A pressure that had been constant for so long, she had stopped registering it lifting away, and in the absence of it, the room felt larger, lighter, different in some way she had no technical word for. The lamp flame, which had burned steady for the entire time she had been speaking, moved. A long, slow movement, bending toward the mirror as if drawn. She looked at the glass. The condensation was forming across the entire surface now, not just the 2 inches at the base, but the full mirror, the whole enormous height of it, as the cold from within met the warmth of the room outside. She watched it collect. She watched it bead and run in slow lines down the glass, and then the glass gave. Not shattering, she had expected shattering, and was prepared for it and did not get it. It was not a breaking, it was a releasing. The sound it made was low and resonant, like a bell struck from inside. One sustained note that passed through the room and through her chest and through the stone of the walls, and then was gone. The cloth fell. The mirror stood uncovered for the first time in 100 years, the full height of it visible. The carved oak frame with its pattern of interlocked branches, and the small figures along the upper edge, the old glass with its slight imperfections and its characteristic breathing quality. Her reflection looked back at her, just her reflection. The room behind her, faithful and accurate, no one else in the glass. Her heart was very loud for a moment, then a hand came through the surface. From the left where he had been standing, a hand appeared from inside the glass, not reflected, not seen through it, but emerging from it, the way a hand emerges from water. Cold, real. solid. The hand of a man who has been very still for a very long time and has decided to stop. She took it. His fingers closed around hers with a grip that was careful and deliberate and unmistakably certain, and she felt the cold of him going all the way up her arm and into her chest, and then slowly beginning to change. Not disappearing, becoming something else, becoming the temperature of a person. He came through. She had estimated his height from the portrait and from the glass, and she had been slightly wrong. He was taller, the difference noticeable now that there was no glass between them to compress the perspective. He stood in the room, and she stood in the room, and they were the same room, the same air, the same lamplight. He looked at her. She looked at him. His face was entirely familiar and entirely new at the same time. The way a voice sounds different when you hear it in person, after knowing it only through a recording, recognizable but with a depth and dimension that the medium had been compressing without her knowing. His eyes were dark grey, not the dark green she had sometimes thought she saw through the glass. His jaw was exactly as she had drawn it from the portrait. His expression was exactly as she had come to know it, composed, careful, unguarded in the way that things become unguarded when there is nothing left to protect them. He was still holding her hand. "Isadora," he said. His voice was the first surprise. She had been reading his face for 10 days and thought she had understood the full vocabulary of him, but his voice was something the glass had never given her. Low, precise, with the particular cadence of someone who had spent a century being careful with words and was, for the first time, speaking them into real air. She found she had nothing to say. This was unusual for her. She stood in the lamplight and held his hand and looked at him and felt that the silence was not empty. He looked around the room slowly, at the walls, the ceiling, the floor, the lamp, the small detailed survey of a person reacquainting themselves with dimensionality, with space that has texture and depth and physical consequence. He looked at the mirror behind him, uncovered now, ordinary now, just old glass in a carved oak frame, showing two people standing in a cold stone room in the lamplight. He looked back at her. "It worked," he said. "Yes," she said. A pause. He was still looking at her face with the specific quality of attention she had come to know, and that was the same, entirely the same, as it had been through the glass. Nothing filtered, nothing compressed. "You came back," he said. "Every morning, every evening." "Yes." "You didn't have to." "I know." He looked at her for another moment. Then carefully, with the deliberate care he brought to everything that mattered, he raised his free hand and touched her face, just briefly. The backs of his fingers against her cheek, cold and then warming, a touch so light it barely registered as physical and registered completely as something else. She did not move away. "Thank you," he said, "for seeing clearly." "Thank you," she said, "for being worth seeing." Mrs. Poole drove them to Derby Station at 4 in the morning, as she had agreed, without questions and without ceremony. She had simply appeared in the kitchen when they came down, her coat on and her keys in her hand, and had looked at Dorian Ashcroft standing in the kitchen in his 1801 coat, with the specific expression of a person who has suspected something for 20 years and is finally seeing the confirmation of it. "You'll need different clothes," she said to him. "Yes," he said. "I'll arrange something before you leave." She turned to the stove to put the kettle on. "Sit down, both of you." They sat. The kitchen was warm and ordinary, and outside the windows, the dark Derbyshire countryside was beginning to show the first pale line of an October dawn. Isadora set the leather case on the table, the notebook, the document, the vial, the account she had written and read aloud, and which had done what it was supposed to do. She looked at Dorian across the table. He looked back. "London," she said. "A solicitor who is not Blackwell, a legal historian, someone who can open a 100-year-old case with the evidence we have." "Yes," he said. "And you will need to learn what has changed," she said. "A great deal has changed." "I imagine so." A pause. The corner of his mouth moved, the same movement she had learned to read through the glass. Not quite a smile, the thing that came before a smile, the consideration of one. You will need to explain most of it to me. I will, she said. And the conversations, he said. You said you would continue them. She looked at him across the kitchen table, in the lamplight and the beginning of the dawn, with the leather case of evidence between them and the whole open, complicated world ahead. Yes, she said. I said that. Good, he said. Simply. The word of a person who has decided something with their whole weight behind it and has no further argument to make about it. Mrs. Poole set tea on the table. Outside, the dawn was coming in properly now, pale and cold and clean, the sky going from black to grey to the particular thin blue of an October morning in Derbyshire. Wintherstone Hall stood behind them, emptied of its long wait. The mirror in the east corridor was just glass now. The north wing room was just a room. The east corridor was just a corridor. The house breathed out. They found a solicitor on the third day in London, a young man named Cartwright, who had a reputation for taking cases that other solicitors found inconvenient, and who read Isadora's account and Vivian Harwell's notebook, and sat quietly for a long time before he said simply, "This is extraordinary." "Yes," she said, "it is." "And the man sitting in my outer office is Dorian Ashcroft," she said, "3rd Earl of Ashcroft, who has a great deal to tell you." The case took 6 months to open and 2 years to resolve. There were difficulties. There were always difficulties with cases 100 years old, with evidence that had no precedent for its preservation, with a witness whose existence required more explanation than any court was prepared to accept, without considerable supporting documentation. But Isadora was thorough. She had always been thorough. And Dorian, it turned out, had a very good memory. Vivian Harwell was found in the spring of 1902 in a small house in the village nearest to Wintherstone, where she had been living in the particular invisibility of a very old woman who has made herself unremarkable over many years. She did not resist. She looked at Isadora when they came, and her expression was, as it had always been, composed. But underneath the composure, for just a moment, was something else. Something that looked, in the end, like relief. She had gone to Wintherstone Hall to catalogue the paintings. She left with something the inventory would never have listed. And in the east corridor of a condemned building in Derbyshire, a mirror that had held the same silence for 100 years stood empty and ordinary in the October light, and the house around it was, for the first time in a very long time, simply a house. Nothing more, nothing less. Enough.
I saw your shadow in the silence, a ghost behind the flame, 100 years of broken echoes calling out my name. I walked through halls that whispered secrets, felt your breath in stone, but in that mirror full of darkness, you were never gone. And every step I took in fear was leading me to you. Through the glass, I found your soul. In the dark, you made me whole. Time was lost, but not the truth. I crossed the night to stand with you. Through the silence, through the silence, through the pain, through 100 years of rain. If love can break what time has sealed, then you were always real. They tried to bury what was living behind a perfect lie, but truth was written in the shadows you could never hide. I heard your voice between the stillness, felt your hand in mine, and in If I had turned away that night, you'd still be trapped in time. But something in your silent eyes refused to let me love. Through the glass, I broke the chain, through the door, through all the pain. Now the dawn is calling you, and I am standing too. No more shadows, no more walls, just your voice when silence calls.